Here are 10 more of the worst cars from the 1960s spanning the globe. These models are remembered for their disappointing designs, poor performance, and mechanical woes, earning their place in automotive infamy. A former owner of the Peel Trident reflects on the experience with a mix of nostalgia, exasperation, and the kind of humor that only comes from surviving a uniquely challenging chapter in life. The Trident, a three-wheeled microcar with its distinctive bubble-like dome, was undeniably a conversation starter. From the moment I saw it, I knew it was one of a kind, but I soon learned there's a big difference between unique and practical. And the Trident lived firmly in the former category, they said. The first challenge was simply fitting into the car. I'm not a tall person, but even I had trouble squeezing inside. There's no traditional door, just a hatch that opens up the entire bubble top. You sort of fold yourself in, and once you're inside, you realize just how small it is. It's technically a two-seater, but you and your passenger are crammed together like sardines. If either of us had a bag or a coat, it had to stay on our laps because there was no other space for it. Once inside, the novelty quickly gave way to frustration. The first time I started the engine, I couldn't believe how loud it was for such a tiny car. The little 49cc motor roared like a chainsaw, and you could feel every vibration in the seat. I thought, well, at least it sounds powerful. But then I tried to drive it. With just 4.2 horsepower under the hood, the Peel Trident was excruciatingly slow. Flat roads were tolerable, but hills, forget about it. The car would struggle and sometimes even stall halfway up. I remember being stuck on an incline once, with a line of cars honking behind me, and all I could do was wave apologetically as I inched forward. The driving experience wasn't just slow, it was nerve-wracking. The three-wheel design makes it inherently unstable. Every corner felt like a gamble, and you had to take turns at a snail's pace to avoid tipping over. And don't even get me started on wind. A strong gust would push the car sideways, and I'd be gripping the steering wheel for dear life. It didn't feel like driving, it felt like trying to survive. The fiberglass body, while lightweight, added little reassurance. It was like sitting in a toy car. I knew if anything larger than a bicycle hit me, the Trident wouldn't stand a chance. Trucks were the worst. When one passed me, the sheer force of the air displacement felt like it might lift the whole car off the ground. I can't count the number of times I prayed just to make it home in one piece. And then there was the dome. Oh, that bubble dome. It looked futuristic, but in reality, it was a nightmare. In the summer, it turned the car into a greenhouse. Within minutes, you'd be drenched in sweat. The lack of proper ventilation made every trip feel like a punishment. In the winter, condensation would build up on the inside of the dome, making visibility a joke. I'd have to pull over just to wipe it down. The car's quirks extended to parking, though here it had a rare advantage. One thing I'll say is that the Trident was easy to park. You could fit it almost anywhere, but that's only because it's so small. People would come up and gawk, asking if it was a toy or a spaceship. At first, it was fun to explain, but eventually, I got tired of the jokes. How fast does it go? They'd ask, and I'd have to admit, not very fast at all. Despite its issues, the owner persevered for a while, hoping the charm would outweigh the drawbacks. I kept telling myself, it's unique, it's economical, it's fun. But the reality was that it wasn't economical. Fuel efficiency isn't impressive when you're constantly stuck in second gear. And fun? Maybe for the people watching me, but certainly not for me. Eventually, practicality won out, and the Trident had to go. Selling it felt bittersweet. On one hand, I was relieved to be rid of its quirks and headaches. On the other hand, I knew I'd never own anything like it again. It's the kind of car you don't really miss driving, but you do miss the stories it gave you. Looking back, the Peel Trident occupies a strange place in automotive history. It wasn't really a car, it was an experiment. And like many experiments, it didn't work out so well. But I'll say this, owning a Trident was an experience I'll never forget. It was absurd, impractical, and occasionally terrifying. But it was mine, and for better or worse, that's something I'll always be able to laugh about. The Chevrolet Corvair Monza, 1965 to 1969, occupies a unique, often controversial spot in automotive history. Lauded for its innovative engineering and sleek design, it was also plagued by flaws that marred its legacy. As a sportier trim of the Corvair lineup, the Monza aimed to attract drivers who wanted a car that stood apart from the traditional offerings of the Big Three. With its European-inspired aesthetics, rear-mounted air-cooled engine, and clean, low-profile design, the Monza looked like a promising choice. However, beneath its stylish exterior lay a series of problems that made it one of the most divisive cars of its era. An owner from that time described their initial excitement when buying the Monza. "I was drawn to it immediately. It didn't look like anything else on the road, almost like a Porsche at a fraction of the price. I liked the idea of owning something different, something sporty. It seemed like a smart choice for a young guy who wanted style but couldn't afford a high-end European car." The excitement didn't last. Within a week of owning it, I started noticing its quirks. The handling felt off. I wasn't an expert driver, but even I could tell that something wasn't quite right when I took it around curves. The rear end seemed unpredictable, especially at higher speeds. You'd feel confident one moment, and the next, the back would start to swing out. It felt like the car wanted to dance, but I was the one left tripping over my feet. The source of the problem was the infamous rear suspension design that had haunted earlier Corvair models. Although Chevrolet had reworked the suspension for the second-generation cars, including the Monza, the improvements were insufficient. The car still exhibited oversteer tendencies, particularly during sudden maneuvers. "I remember one rainy afternoon," the owner recounted. "I wasn't even going that fast, but the back wheels slid out as I turned onto my street. It was terrifying. After that, I avoided driving it in bad weather unless I had no other choice." Reliability was another issue. The Corvair Monza's unique rear-mounted air-cooled engine, while innovative, came with its own set of challenges. The engine had this tendency to overheat, especially in stop-and-go traffic. And don't even get me started on the fan belt. That thing snapped so many times I lost count. I started carrying a spare in the trunk, just to be safe, along with the tools to fix it on the spot. Beyond mechanical concerns, the car's build quality left much to be desired. The interior looked good at first glance, but after a few months, things started to fall apart. The seats would tear, the dashboard rattled, and there were always little issues that made it feel cheap, even though it wasn't. It was frustrating because the Monza was supposed to be the upscale version of the Corvair. I can't imagine what the base model was like. The Corvair's reputation didn't help matters. Ralph Nader's 1965 book, Unsafe at Any Speed, had taken aim at the Corvair's handling issues, labeling it a danger to drivers and passengers alike. Public perception of the car plummeted, and owners like this one found themselves defending their choice. People would give me this look when I said I drove a Corvair. "Oh, that's the car that flips over, right?" I heard that 100 times. It was like driving a punchline. Even when I was careful to explain that the Monza had a reworked suspension, nobody cared. The damage was done. Despite its flaws, the Monza had its moments. When it was working properly, it was actually a fun car to drive. The engine sounded unique, sort of like a VW Beetle, but a little throatier. And it was comfortable enough for short trips. The bucket seats were sporty, and the cabin design was clean and modern for the time. Ultimately, though, the negatives outweighed the positives. It was a love-hate relationship. I loved the way it looked and the idea of what it could have been, but I hated the reality of dealing with its problems. After 2 years, I couldn't do it anymore. I sold it and got something more reliable. Looking back, I don't regret owning it. It was an experience, but it's not a car I'd want to go through again. The Chevrolet Corvair Monza stands as a cautionary tale in automotive history, a car full of potential undone by engineering missteps and public mistrust. For those who owned one, it remains a bittersweet memory, a bold experiment that could never quite escape its flaws. The Wartburg 311, manufactured in East Germany from 1956 to 1965, was a mid-sized family car that quickly became known for its dated engineering and serious reliability issues. At a time when much of the world was embracing modern engineering and efficiency in automotive design, the 311 was built around an outdated two-stroke engine that severely limited its capabilities and made it unpopular with drivers both in East Germany and beyond the Iron Curtain. While its purpose was to offer affordable, everyday transportation to the people of East Germany, its poor performance and questionable build quality led to frustration among its owners. For those who owned one, the Wartburg 311 became a symbol of both economic hardship and compromised practicality. A former owner of the car described his experience. "When we first bought it, it was all we could afford, and for the time, it seemed like it might work. The Wartburg was economical, but the trade-off was more than we bargained for. The two-stroke engine was noisy and smoked like a chimney. It was never a quiet ride, and I always felt like I was driving something on the edge of breaking down." The two-stroke engine, which was originally chosen for its simplicity and low production cost, became one of the car's most significant drawbacks. While it was easy to maintain compared to more complex engines, it emitted far more pollutants and was considerably less efficient. The exhaust was awful, the owner continued. I would constantly get glances from other drivers who were probably wondering what in the world was coming out of the tailpipe. The fumes would fill the cabin if you didn't have the windows open, and it made long drives unbearable. While the engine was a major factor, the problems didn't end there. The car was rusting almost from the moment we got it. The bodywork was flimsy, and if it rained, you could see the rust creeping in underneath. Parts would start to break down with alarming regularity. We were constantly making repairs, and it seemed like there was always something wrong with it. Whether it was the suspension, the steering, or the electrical system, the brakes would get soft after a few years, and there were times I was afraid I wouldn't be able to stop. Beyond the mechanical flaws, the Wartburg 311 struggled with overall build quality. Everything about it felt cheap, the owner remarked. The interior looked like it was made from leftover materials, and the seats were uncomfortable. You couldn't adjust the heating properly, and in winter, the cold would creep in through the windows because the seals were so poor. The ride was bumpy, and you always felt every pothole in the road. There was no sense of comfort or luxury, just a constant feeling of, this car was made for utility, not for you. The 311th's outdated engineering also made it difficult to handle. The rear engine design might have been a novelty in the 1950s, but by the time the 311 came out, it was already behind the times, the owner recalled. It had poor traction, and you could feel the back end slipping out on wet roads. It was scary to drive in the rain, and when you drove on highways, the engine just didn't have the power to keep up with the faster cars. It was a struggle to maintain any speed on a long trip. Another aspect that hurt the Wartburg's reputation was the long wait times to receive one. In East Germany, everyone wanted one, but the waiting list was endless, the owner said. By the time you finally got the car, you'd probably seen a dozen newer models from the West, and you couldn't help but feel like you were driving something from a different era. The Wartburg felt outdated before it even left the factory floor. Despite its shortcomings, the Wartburg 311 did serve a purpose for a certain group of people. For some, it was their only option, and I get that, the owner explained. In a country where you didn't have a lot of choices, it was a way to get from point A to point B. But the longer we had it, the more I realized that it was just a relic of a time when cars were built for a different purpose. It never had the chance to be a truly reliable vehicle. For the time, it was cheap, but it also cost us in maintenance, time, and frustration. In countries outside the Eastern Bloc, the Wartburg 311 was often dismissed as a poor substitute for the more modern cars of the West. When we drove it across the border into Poland, people would just stare at it like it was a relic. It was like they couldn't understand how we still managed to drive this thing. Outside of East Germany, it was a joke, and it didn't have the prestige or reputation of other cars. The car itself just felt like something you couldn't take seriously. The Wartburg 311 struggle to remain relevant, even in its home market, eventually led to its obsolescence. By the time the 311 was out of production, it had already lost its place in the world, the owner concluded. The Pontiac Tempest, produced from 1961 to 1963, is often cited as one of the most ambitious, yet ultimately flawed attempts at compact car engineering in American automotive history. Initially, the Tempest seemed to promise a revolutionary shift in car design, offering a rear-mounted transaxle that was intended to improve handling and weight distribution. For a compact car, this was a bold move, aiming to challenge the norms of the time. The idea was innovative and captured attention when it first appeared, but the execution quickly proved problematic. One of the most common complaints from owners was the car's performance and handling. Despite its pioneering drivetrain design, the Tempest quickly earned a reputation for vibrations and instability. A former owner recalls, "When I first got the Tempest, I thought it was going to be something special. The rear-mounted transaxle seemed like such a novel idea, but it was clear from the start that it just didn't work the way they'd hoped. The vibrations were unbearable. Every time I tried to take it on the highway, the car would shake so much that it felt like the engine was going to fall out. At first, I thought maybe it was just a quirk I'd get used to, but after a while, it became impossible to ignore." The rear-mounted transaxle, which was meant to enhance weight distribution and handling, instead created a set of unique and troublesome issues for the car. The unusual drivetrain configuration resulted in poor road manners, especially at higher speeds. The car never felt stable, no matter how gently you took a corner. It was like driving a car with an unpredictable temper. At low speeds, it was manageable, but once you hit 50 miles per hour or more, It felt like the car was just out of control. You could feel it swaying and fighting against itself on the road, said another former owner. It was as though the design was so ahead of its time that the engineering wasn't ready for it. In addition to the handling issues, the Pontiac Tempest struggled with mechanical reliability. Early models suffered from a range of issues, including frequent breakdowns and the notorious failure of parts that were integral to its performance. The engine had constant overheating problems, recalled one owner. It didn't matter how much maintenance I did on it, the engine would always run too hot. That was a huge headache. And the transmission, well, it was a nightmare. I had to replace it after only 30,000 miles, and that was with regular servicing. The parts just weren't up to the task. Reliability wasn't the only problem. The build quality of the Tempest was widely criticized. The interior was just cheap. You could tell Pontiac had cut corners, another owner mentioned. The dashboard felt like something out of a low-end car, and the seats were hard as rocks. I had a hard time staying comfortable, even on short drives. The plastic and vinyl materials didn't hold up well either. The trim around the windows would peel off, and the carpets would wear out so quickly that you'd have holes in the floor mats in no time. For a car that was marketed as a compact that could stand out in terms of both innovation and affordability, these shortcomings made the Tempest feel like a car built more for novelty than actual reliability. On top of its design and quality issues, the Pontiac Tempest was also held back by its lack of refinement. It was supposed to be a modern compact car, but its quirky drivetrain and mediocre performance left it feeling rough around the edges. The thing about the Tempest was that it wasn't a bad idea, it was just poorly executed. If they had taken more time to iron out the issues with the suspension and the drivetrain, it could have been a solid car, but instead, it felt rushed. They weren't trying too hard to be different, and in the process, they missed the mark entirely, said a former Pontiac mechanic who worked on the Tempest in his shop. The Pontiac Tempest's lasting legacy is that of an innovation that came too early and was poorly implemented. Though the car had its moments of potential, it was overshadowed by its flaws. The handling issues, coupled with its reliability problems and lack of refinement, ultimately led to the Tempest being phased out in favor of more traditional designs. In the end, the Tempest's unique engineering was its undoing. While it certainly marked an ambitious attempt to break away from the conventional, it simply wasn't ready for prime time. Pontiac would later adopt more traditional engineering for its future compact models, but the Tempest remains an example of what happens when ambition surpasses execution. It became a cautionary tale in automotive history. Innovation needs to be paired with solid engineering and attention to detail, or it risks falling short of its potential. In the case of the Tempest, its failure to live up to the promise of its groundbreaking design ultimately relegated. The Zundapp Janus, produced between 1957 and 1961, is one of the most unusual cars ever built. With its quirky and unconventional design that still draws curiosity today. A bubble car, the Janus was marketed as an affordable, small city car in post-war Germany, a time when smaller vehicles were becoming increasingly popular due to fuel shortages and economic constraints. However, despite its bold concept, the Janus quickly earned a reputation as a poorly executed oddity, falling short of what many expected from a functional vehicle. The most immediately striking feature of the Zundapp Janus is its dual-facing door design. Unlike traditional cars, which have front-facing doors for front passengers and rear-facing doors for those sitting in the back, the Janus had doors at both the front and rear, opening outwards in a symmetrical fashion. While this design was meant to be a novel feature to ease entry and exit in tight spaces, it ended up being impractical, creating an odd and confusing user experience. It felt like I was getting into a toy car every time I climbed in, said one former owner. The doors were just weird, and they often got stuck or wouldn't close properly. It wasn't a practical solution for a city car at all. Powered by a tiny 14-horsepower engine, the Janus struggled to provide sufficient performance for even basic driving tasks. With such a low-powered engine, it was often described as painfully slow, struggling to reach any meaningful speed, even on flat roads. It felt like the engine was always screaming, but it wasn't going anywhere, recalled another former owner. You could barely keep up with traffic, and going uphill was a nightmare. It didn't have the power to drive like a normal car, and you constantly felt like you were going to stall out in the middle of an intersection. The car's performance was a major downside, as its engine was not only underpowered but also unreliable, often requiring frequent maintenance and repair. The Janus was also a victim of its own design quirks, which made it feel more like a toy than a legitimate means of transportation. Its small size and unconventional shape while charming to some, gave it an impression of fragility that turned many buyers away. The body, built with a lightweight construction, was prone to damage, and the car's ride was often described as harsh and uncomfortable. One former owner shared, "It was like driving a lawnmower. There was no cushioning, no suspension to speak of. You could feel every bump in the road, and the seats were basically just hard plastic. It didn't matter if you were driving for 10 minutes or an hour, it was always uncomfortable." Safety was another major issue with the Zundapp Janus. Like many bubble cars of its era, it lacked the structural integrity and crash protection that modern vehicles take for granted. The small, lightweight construction of the car, combined with its lack of safety features, meant that it was incredibly vulnerable in an accident. "I always felt unsafe driving it," said a former driver. "It was like being in a toy car surrounded by real cars. It didn't offer any protection if you got into an accident, and I'd always be nervous driving in traffic." Another flaw was the Janus's minimal comfort. The tiny two-seat cabin was cramped and lacking in modern conveniences. There was little in terms of interior features, with basic utilitarian furnishings and no air conditioning, heating, or any other comfort features that would make it tolerable for long trips. It was all about bare essentials. The dashboard had almost nothing on it, just a few knobs and switches. It wasn't even a pleasant place to be in, which was a huge letdown when you're stuck in traffic or driving long distances, said a former owner. The Zundapp Janus was ultimately a commercial failure, despite its bold attempt to redefine the concept of a small city car. It failed to meet the needs of everyday drivers, offering poor performance, safety, and comfort. At its best, it was a novelty car, a strange little footnote in automotive history. It was never going to compete with the likes of Volkswagen or even the more basic economy cars of the time. The Janus was a solution to a problem that didn't exist, said one former mechanic. It was an oddball creation, but the market didn't have room for a car that was more about quirk than function. The Zundapp Janus became a collector's item for those interested in the bizarre and unusual cars of the 1950s, but in its time, it was largely seen as a failure. With its underpowered engine, awkward design, and lack of practicality, it was a curious experiment that missed the mark, and it quickly faded into obscurity. Despite the charm it may hold for enthusiasts today, the Janus will always be remembered as one of the more perplexing and unsuccessful attempts at creating a microcar. The Ford Taunus P3, produced from 1960 to 1964, was part of Ford's strategy to increase its footprint in the European market. Aimed at providing a more affordable option in the mid-size sedan category, the P3 was notable for its bold and unusual design, an experiment that ended up leaving many potential buyers unimpressed. The model was dubbed the bathtub because of its rounded, almost bulbous shape, which, instead of being futuristic, made it look clunky and odd. This design choice became one of the most talked about aspects of the car, with many finding it aesthetically unappealing. The first time I laid eyes on it, I thought it looked like a car that had been melted and then put back together. It wasn't a car that you'd want to show off in your driveway, said one former owner, who had bought the P3 in the early 60s. This rounded, almost shapeless design was a stark departure from the sharp lines and angles that were common in cars of that era, making it feel out of place even in its own time. The car's curvy silhouette, while trying to be progressive, came across as bloated and lacked the sleekness that European buyers were starting to expect. It was a case of Ford trying too hard to be different, and in the process, they missed the mark entirely, said another former owner. The car didn't exude the kind of confidence or modernity that many buyers were looking for, but the design wasn't the only thing that let the Ford Taunus P3 down. While it was marketed as a mid-sized sedan, the car's performance left much to be desired. Despite being a sedan, the car was powered by a small engine that provided insufficient acceleration for highway speeds. "When I first drove it, I felt like I was always lagging behind the flow of traffic," one driver recalled. "The engine just wasn't powerful enough for a car of its size, and it always felt like I had to work it harder than I should have." The Taunus P3's modest engine simply couldn't provide the performance needed for a smooth and comfortable drive, especially at higher speeds. The handling of the car didn't help matters either. The P3 was heavy and sluggish around corners, and the steering felt too loose. "It didn't give you much confidence when you were driving," another owner described. Its poor handling, coupled with its sluggish acceleration, made it feel more like a chore to drive than a pleasure. It lacked the driving dynamics that many other cars in its class offered, which left owners feeling like they had settled for a less than exciting vehicle. The interior of the Ford Taunus P3 didn't fare much better. Though Ford tried to position the P3 as a mid-range sedan, its cramped interior made it feel more like a compact car than anything else. It was supposed to be a family car, but the back seats were so tight that you couldn't sit comfortably for more than a short drive, said one former passenger. Even in the front, the space felt claustrophobic. If you were tall, forget about it. Your knees would hit the dashboard. The interior layout felt cramped, and the cheap materials used in its construction didn't help matters. Many buyers found that the cabin, although basic, was poorly laid out and lacked comfort, which led to frustration over time. It had the kind of interior you'd expect in a car that was much cheaper, not one that was marketed as a step-up, one former buyer remarked. Additionally, the build quality was questionable. The Ford Taunus P3's construction was fragile, with many owners reporting that the body would dent easily or that the paint would chip off far too quickly. I remember driving through a tight space and brushing against a wall, and the next thing I knew, I had a huge dent in the side of the car, said another former owner. The build was just flimsy, and it didn't feel solid. You could tell it wasn't built to last. This lack of durability, coupled with a lack of strength in the bodywork, meant the car was vulnerable to rust and damage. The car's handling, poor acceleration, cramped interior, and fragile build quality were compounded by another major flaw: the Ford Taunus P3's failure to live up to its promise in terms of reliability. Owners often found themselves facing constant mechanical issues. We had to take it to the shop regularly, and the engine was always causing us problems. It would stall without warning, especially on the highway, said one disgruntled former owner. The car's mechanical issues were often linked to its rear suspension, which was known to be unstable at higher speeds, adding another layer of danger to an already unreliable vehicle. You'd be going along and suddenly feel like the car was about to flip over. It just didn't inspire any trust, another driver recalled. By the mid-1960s, the Ford Taunus P3 was quickly losing its appeal as competition grew and other car manufacturers introduced more refined, reliable vehicles. The P3 was left behind. The Austin A40 Farina, produced from 1958 to 1967, was introduced as a compact family car designed in collaboration with the renowned Italian design firm Pininfarina. While the A40's stylish European-influenced design was seen as a positive feature at the time, it quickly became apparent that the car's performance and practicality left much to be desired. One of the most significant drawbacks of the Austin A40 Farina was its underpowered engine. Despite its good looks, the A40 struggled to keep up with the demands of everyday driving. The engine, a 1.0-liter or 1.1-liter, was simply not up to the task of powering a car of its size. Owners often reported that acceleration was sluggish, especially when the car was fully loaded, making overtaking or merging onto highways a daunting task. It felt like you were always waiting for the engine to catch up, recalled one longtime owner. It was fine for city driving, but when you had to get on the motorway, it was another story altogether. The A40's performance issues were compounded by its handling, which many found to be less than ideal. While the car's chassis was relatively well engineered for its time, the suspension system couldn't quite manage the balance between comfort and stability. On the road, the A40 felt a bit bouncy, and its steering was often described as vague, making it less enjoyable to drive than other cars in its class. It was never a car you looked forward to driving, said one former owner. It did the job, but it wasn't fun, and you couldn't rely on it for anything too adventurous. Another major issue with the Austin A40 Farina was its susceptibility to rust. While rust issues were common among many British cars of the era, the A40 seemed particularly prone to it. The car's bodywork would often develop corrosion around the wheel arches, door sills, and underneath, leading to expensive repairs. I had to keep an eye on the rust, constantly treating it to keep it at bay. But no matter what I did, it just kept coming back, said one former owner. It was a nightmare to maintain in that regard. Despite being marketed as a family car, the A40 was relatively cramped compared to its competitors. While it wasn't necessarily uncomfortable for short journeys, the interior felt tight for taller passengers, and the lack of space made it less practical for families who needed more room. The rear seats in particular were somewhat restrictive, and the trunk was small, limiting the car's ability to carry luggage or other items for longer trips. It was fine for short drives around town, but anything longer and you started to feel cramped, said another former driver. It wasn't the kind of car you'd want to take on a family vacation. The A40 Farina also lacked many of the modern features that were becoming standard in other vehicles during the 1960s. While it had the basics, it didn't offer the kind of comfort or technological advancements that buyers were beginning to expect from a car. For example, The lack of power steering and air conditioning made the driving experience less comfortable compared to more feature-rich rivals from other manufacturers. As other brands began offering improved safety features and more advanced designs, the A40 felt increasingly dated. Additionally, the car's awkward proportions were a point of contention. While the styling itself, designed by Farina, was generally regarded as appealing for its time, the proportions of the A40 never quite came together in a way that made it a standout. It had a sort of odd look, with the rear end feeling slightly off compared to the rest of the car, said one critic. It didn't have the balance or elegance of some of its European competitors. In terms of reliability, the A40 wasn't particularly outstanding either. Though it had a solid reputation for being easy to repair, the car still had a tendency to develop mechanical issues over time, particularly with its engine and electrical systems. It was generally dependable, but there were moments when it felt like it would break down just when you needed it most, said one former owner. I had to keep a toolbox in the boot at all times. The Austin A40 Farina ultimately did not age well and was quickly overtaken by more modern and reliable competitors. While it offered a stylish design at the time of its release, its lack of power, rust problems, cramped interior, and outdated features made it less appealing as the years went by. When compared to its rivals like the Ford Anglia or the Morris Minor, the A40 felt outdated both in terms of performance and design. Despite its early success, the A40 eventually faded into obscurity, with many owners moving on to newer, more capable models. Looking back, the Austin A40 Farina remains a classic example of a car that, while promising at the time of its release, failed to live up to its potential due to a combination of mechanical shortcomings and a lack. The Rover P6 2000, produced between 1963 and 1977, was introduced as a luxury sedan that aimed to showcase the best of British engineering. With its sleek design and sophisticated technology, it was expected to rival the best European sedans of the era, including offerings from Mercedes-Benz and BMW. However, despite its potential, the P6 2000 became infamous for a series of problems that overshadowed its ambition. One of the major issues with the P6 2000 was its reliability, or rather, the lack of it. Early models were plagued with mechanical failures that left many owners frustrated. Engine failure was a common complaint, with some owners experiencing problems as early as 10,000 miles. The engine, while innovative in its design, often struggled to maintain consistent performance, leading to frequent breakdowns. I had to have the engine rebuilt twice in the first few years of ownership, recalled one former owner. It was as if the car just wasn't built to last. Electrical malfunctions were another widespread issue. The P6 2000's electrical system, which was meant to offer advanced features for the time, often failed to live up to expectations. Many owners reported problems with the wiring and switches, leading to everything from faulty lights to malfunctioning dashboard instruments. It felt like the car was more trouble than it was worth when the electrical system started playing up, said another former owner. It was a constant headache. Adding to the frustration was the complexity of the P6 2000's design. While the car was hailed for its innovative features such as the independent rear suspension and a unitary construction body, these very features made the car difficult to repair when things went wrong. Mechanics, unfamiliar with the intricacies of the Rover's design, often found themselves at a loss when it came to diagnosing and fixing problems. It was a nightmare to repair, said one mechanic who worked on P6 2000s during the 1960s and 70s. The design was so advanced for the time, but that made it a challenge to work on. Parts were hard to source, and you couldn't always get to the problem without tearing half the car apart. The car's complicated layout, which included a unique suspension system and a highly integrated dashboard, made routine maintenance a daunting task. For many owners, the cost and difficulty of repairs added up quickly, further detracting from the P6 2000's appeal. It was a beautiful car, no doubt about that, but the cost of maintaining it was just too high for what you got in return, said one longtime owner. I loved the car's looks and its ride quality, but I couldn't afford to keep fixing it every time something went wrong. In terms of driving experience, while the P6 2000 was lauded for its comfort and refinement, it wasn't without its shortcomings. The handling, while competent, was often described as uninspiring compared to its German rivals. The car's weight, combined with its soft suspension, made it feel less agile than other luxury sedans of the era, and the steering lacked the precision expected in a premium vehicle. While the P6 was certainly a comfortable cruiser, it was far from being a driver's car. The luxury aspect of the P6 2000 was also questioned as the years went on. While the interior featured a clean, minimalist design, Many found the materials and finishes to be subpar when compared to other luxury brands. The dashboard, for example, was often criticized for being cluttered and not as polished as that of more expensive sedans. It was supposed to be a luxury car, but it didn't feel like one when you were inside, recalled another owner. The dashboard was ugly and everything felt a bit cheap for the price. Despite these drawbacks, the Rover P6 2000 still has its supporters, with some enthusiasts appreciating its unique design and British engineering. However, for most of its owners, the car's unreliable nature and the difficulty of maintaining it soured the experience. While the P6 2000 was a car that had the potential to compete with Europe's best, its engineering flaws, coupled with high repair costs, ultimately overshadowed its promise. Today, the Rover P6 2000 is remembered with mixed feelings. Some owners view it as a car ahead of its time, one that suffered from poor execution and an overcomplicated design. Others remember the constant headaches and the sense of disappointment that came with owning a car that looked so promising on paper but failed to deliver in practice. "It was a car I wanted to love, but it was just too unreliable," said one final owner. "It looked fantastic, but the truth is, it was a nightmare to own." The P6 2000's legacy is one of unfulfilled potential. While it remained a stylish and technologically advanced vehicle for its time, its mechanical issues and complicated design prevented it from becoming the British luxury sedan it had the potential to be. The 1967 Mercury Comet Cyclone GT was Mercury's bold attempt to carve out a space in the burgeoning muscle car market, a segment exploding in popularity thanks to iconic models like the Ford Mustang, Pontiac GTO, and Dodge Charger. Unfortunately, the Cyclone GT couldn't keep up with its rivals, struggling with an identity crisis, performance limitations, and a host of design and quality issues that left it feeling like a half-hearted contender in an intensely competitive market. On paper, the Cyclone GT had potential. Its most significant selling point was the 390 cubic inch V8 engine under the hood, rated at 335 horsepower. A respectable figure for the time. Mercury paired this with a 3-speed automatic or a 4-speed manual transmission, giving buyers a choice of drivetrains. But while the numbers looked good in advertisements, the car's real-world performance was less inspiring. Weighing over 3,400 pounds, the Cyclone GT was hampered by its bulk. This excess weight made acceleration sluggish compared to leaner and more aggressive competitors. One former owner described the car's performance as all bark and no bite. Despite the growl of its V8, it struggled to deliver the thrilling speed muscle car enthusiasts expected. It felt like it wanted to go fast, but the weight just held it back, they explained. This sluggishness wasn't just noticeable in straight-line acceleration. It also affected handling, which was another weak point. The Cyclone GT suspension was soft and tuned more for comfort than for the sharp, responsive handling buyers craved. On twisty roads, the car felt cumbersome, with noticeable body roll and a lack of precision. As another owner put it, "You didn't drive this car hard, you guided it gently and hoped for the best." The styling of the Cyclone GT added to its struggles. Mercury aimed for a sporty look with unique details like racing stripes, simulated hood scoops, and distinctive badging. However, these features couldn't mask the car's awkward proportions and overly busy design. Compared to the sleek and aggressive Mustang or the bold, menacing Charger, the Cyclone GT looked indecisive. It seemed caught between Mercury's traditionally conservative design language and the edgier aesthetic that defined the muscle car era. This mix left many buyers unimpressed. It was trying to be a muscle car, but it still had too much of that Mercury DNA, one collector remarked. It was like your dad's car trying to dress up as something cool. Another source of frustration for buyers was the Cyclone GT's interior. While Mercury attempted to position the car as a more refined option in the muscle car market, the execution fell short. The cabin featured materials and finishes that were slightly above average for the segment, but they failed to deliver a sense of luxury. Worse still, many owners reported fit and finish issues, with rattling panels, uneven trim, and poor durability. The seats looked good in the showroom, but after a few months, they were already showing wear, one owner recalled. The lack of modern features such as advanced gauges or comfort amenities made the Cyclone GT feel outdated compared to competitors. Reliability issues further compounded the car's problems. Owners frequently dealt with mechanical gremlins, ranging from temperamental transmissions to electrical failures. The engine, though powerful, was prone to overheating under heavy use, a major drawback for a car marketed as a high-performance model. "I spent more time fixing that car than driving it," one frustrated owner admitted. This unreliability not only annoyed buyers, but also made the Cyclone GT a tough sell on the used market, where it quickly depreciated. Price was another critical factor in the Cyclone GT's downfall. Mercury positioned it as a slightly more upscale alternative to the Ford Mustang, but this strategy backfired. Buyers willing to spend extra for a muscle car often opted for higher-end, better-performing models like the Pontiac GTO or Chevrolet Chevelle SS. Meanwhile, those seeking value stuck with the Mustang, which offered similar performance in a more attractive and affordable package. The Cyclone GT found itself stranded in a no-man's land, too expensive for budget-conscious buyers and not compelling enough for those seeking premium muscle cars. Despite its flaws, the Cyclone GT did have a niche appeal. Some buyers were drawn to its rarity and appreciated its attempt to blend muscle car performance with Mercury's traditional emphasis on comfort. Today, the Cyclone GT has found a small but dedicated following among collectors who value its unique place in automotive history. However, even among enthusiasts, it's often remembered as a car that failed to live up to its potential. In retrospect, the 1967 Mercury Comet Cyclone GT serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of focus and execution in the automotive world. By trying to be both a muscle car and a refined cruiser, the Toyota Publica, introduced in 1961, was Toyota's response to Japan's growing need for affordable, family-oriented transportation in the post-war era. It was designed to comply with the People's Car Project, a government initiative aimed at creating small, inexpensive vehicles accessible to the average Japanese family. While the Publica was a bold attempt to revolutionize mobility in Japan, early models left much to be desired, earning it a reputation as one of Toyota's more forgettable missteps. Powered by a tiny 697 cubic centimeter, two-cylinder air-cooled engine, the early Publica produced a mere 28 horsepower. On paper, this level of power was sufficient for city driving and short commutes. However, in practice, it was woefully inadequate for anything more demanding. Owners often complained that the car struggled on even slight inclines and required significant effort to maintain a steady speed. Highway driving was nearly impossible, with the car topping out at a sluggish 100 kilometers per hour, 62 miles per hour, under ideal conditions. It felt like the car was giving its all just to keep up with bicycles on hills. One owner quipped, highlighting the frustration of owning such an underpowered vehicle. The Publica's compact size and budget-friendly design inevitably led to compromises in build quality and comfort. The interior was Spartan, to say the least. Seats were thinly padded and provided little support, making longer trips an exercise in endurance. The dashboard was bare bones with minimal instrumentation and controls, emphasizing functionality over any semblance of aesthetic or luxury. Noise insulation was practically non-existent. Engine vibrations and road noise penetrated the cabin, making conversations at speed a challenge. "It was like riding inside a tin can with wheels," said one owner, recalling their experience. The harsh ride quality, combined with the constant racket, left many buyers regretting their decision. Adding to the Publica's woes was its reputation for being cheaply built. The body panels were thin and prone to denting, while early mechanical reliability left much to be desired. Frequent issues with the engine and drivetrain were common complaints among early adopters, leading to repeated trips to the repair shop. In a market already skeptical about small cars, these issues didn't help Toyota's cause. "It was a car that taught you patience," an owner once joked, referencing the constant tinkering required to keep the vehicle on the road. The design of the early Publica didn't do it any favors either. While its compact proportions were practical for Japan's narrow streets, the car's overall styling was uninspiring and lacked the charm seen in competitors like the Subaru 360. The utilitarian appearance failed to capture the imagination of buyers, especially younger customers who were looking for a more stylish alternative. As one observer put it, the Publica looked like it was built by an accountant with a ruler. Straightforward, but utterly devoid of personality. Despite its many flaws, the Publica wasn't entirely without merit. It was highly fuel efficient, a crucial selling point during a period when fuel prices and economic concerns were top of mind. Additionally, its small size made it easy to maneuver and park in Japan's crowded urban environments. Toyota, recognizing the shortcomings of the early models, quickly introduced improvements in later versions. By the mid-1960s, the Publica received more powerful engines, enhanced interiors, and better build quality, which helped it regain some credibility. In hindsight, the Toyota Publica represents an important chapter in Toyota's evolution as a global automaker. It was a stepping stone in Toyota's journey to mastering the art of affordable, reliable transportation, lessons that would later be perfected in models like the Corolla. However, for those who owned the early Publica, the experience was more a trial of endurance than a joy of driving. As one nostalgic owner remarked, "It wasn't the car you wanted, it was the car you put up with. But in its own way, it got you where you needed to go eventually." Today, the Toyota Publica is a rare sight, largely overshadowed by its successors. Yet, it holds a place in automotive history as a symbol of Japan's post-war recovery and the growing pains of an industry learning to balance innovation with practicality. It might not have been a great car, but it was a necessary one.